Well, welcome to another episode of Traveling Through History. Tonight, we talk about one of the most consequential historical figures of the 19th century or the 1800s, and really the late 1700s as well. And we're talking about Napoleon Bonaparte, or Napoleon I, the Emperor of France. And this is a man who rose from really humble beginnings in Corsica. At first in his life, did not even really think of himself as French. And then, of course, rose up through the ranks in the French society, became a military officer at a very early age in the French military, rose up the ranks in the military itself, got himself to the very highest ranks of general. And then the rest is history. And we'll go through that history tonight in great detail about how he rose through the ranks all the way up to eventually Emperor of France, and looked at himself as a leader for life for the French people. He was known, of course, for his military exploits and his conquering of most of Europe, including parts of Russia. Was one of the greatest conquerors in human history, especially after BC. And of course, he impacted European history, European culture in so many ways, it's really immeasurable. Still having a huge impact even today in military strategy and many other things that we do, including simple things like driving on the right side of the road, which was a big impact that he had in culture. So we'll talk about all that tonight as we get into Napoleon I, Emperor of France. We'll talk about his rise, we'll talk about his downfall, and we'll talk about the major impacts he had in our society. So let's talk about his history. So Napoleon I was born August 15th, 1769 in Corsica. He died May 5th, 1821 in St Helena Island, and he was actually in captivity when he died. He was a French general. He was the first consul of France from 1799 to 1804, and then eventually he was emperor of France from 1804 to 1815. One of the most celebrated persons in the history of the West. He revolutionized military organization and training. He sponsored the Napoleonic Code, the prototype of later civil law codes that most Western countries use today. He reorganized education. He established the long-lived Concordat with the papacy, which was a partnership with the religious sects within the Western countries. Napoleon's many reforms left a lasting mark on the institutions of France and much of Western Europe, but his driving passion was military expansion and French domination across all of Europe. Though at his fall, he left France little larger than it had been at the outbreak of the Revolution in 1789. He was almost unanimously revered during his lifetime, and until the end of the Second Empire under his nephew Napoleon III, as one of history's greatest heroes. Napoleon was born in Corsica shortly after the island's secession to France by the Genoese. He was the fourth and second surviving child of Carlo Bonaparte, a lawyer, and his wife Letizia Romolio. His father's family of ancient Tuscan nobility had emigrated to Corsica in the 16th century. Carlo Bonaparte had married the beautiful and strong-willed Letizia when she was only 14 years old. They eventually had 8 children to bring up in very difficult times in Corsica. The French occupation of their native country was resisted by a number of Corsicans led by Pasquale Paoli. Carlo Bonaparte joined Paoli's party, but when Paoli had to flee, Bonaparte came to terms with the French. Winning the protection of the governor of Corsica, he was appointed assessor for the judicial district of Ajaccio in 1771. In 1778, he obtained the admission of his eldest sons, Joseph and Napoleon, to the College d'Eton. A Corsican by birth, heredity, and childhood associations, Napoleon continued for some time after his arrival in continental France to regard himself a foreigner. Yet, from age 9, he was educated in France, as other Frenchmen were. While the tendency to see Napoleon in reincarnation a reincarnation of some 14th century Italian couture is an overemphasis one aspect of his character, he did, in fact, share neither the traditions nor the prejudices of his new country. Remaining a Corsican in temperament, he was first and foremost through both his education and his reading, a man of the 18th century. Napoleon was educated at 3 different schools, briefly at Autun, as we mentioned earlier, for 5 years at the Military College of Brienne, and finally 1 year at the Military Academy in Paris. It was during Napoleon's year in Paris that his father died of a stomach cancer in February 1785, leaving his family in very difficult circumstances. Napoleon, although not the eldest son, assumed the position of head of the family before he was 16. In September, he graduated from the Military Academy, ranking 43rd out of 58. So he was not a very good student, but a good leader. He was made second lieutenant of artillery in the regiment of La Fère, a kind of training school for young artillery officers. He was garrisoned at Valence. Napoleon continued his education, reading very much, in particular works on strategy and tactics. He also wrote Letters sur la Corse, in which he reveals his feeling for his native island of Corsica. He went back to Corsica in September 1786 and did not rejoin his regiment until June of 1788. So he essentially went home for about 2 years in the interim. By the time the agitation that was to culminate in the French Revolution had already begun once he returned. A reader of Voltaire and of Rousseau, Napoleon believed that a political change was imperative, but as a career officer, he seems not to have seen any need for radical social reforms. In 1789, the National Assembly, which had convened to establish a constitutional monarchy, allowed Paoli to return to Corsica. Napoleon asked for leave and in September joined Paoli's group. But Paoli had no sympathy for the young man whose father had deserted his cause and whom he considered to be a foreigner. Disappointed, Napoleon returned to France, and in April 1791, he was appointed first lieutenant to the 4th Regiment of Artillery garrisoned at Valence again. He had once joined the Jacobin Club, a debating society initially favoring a constitutional monarchy at first. He had once joined the Jacobin Club, a debating society initially favoring a constitutional monarchy, and soon became its president, making speeches against nobles, monks, and bishops. In September 1791, he got leave to go back to Corsica again for 3 months. Elected lieutenant colonel in the National Guard, he soon fell out with Paoli, its commander-in-chief. When he failed to return to France, he was listed as a deserter in January of 1792. But in April, France declared war against Austria, and his offense was forgiven, and he rejoined the military. Apparently through patronage, Napoleon was promoted to the rank of captain, but did not rejoin his old regiment. Instead, he returned to Corsica in October 1792, where Paoli was exercising dictatorial powers and preparing to separate Corsica from France. Napoleon, however, joined the Corsican Jacobins, who opposed Paoli's policy. When civil war broke out in Corsica in April 1793, Paoli had the Bonaparte family condemned to perpetual execration and infamy, whereupon they all fled to France. Napoleon Bonaparte, as he may henceforth be called, rejoined his regiment at Nice in June of 1793. In his Le Super de Bécourt, written at this time, he argued vigorously for united action by all Republicans rallied around the Jacobins, who were becoming progressively more radical, and the National Convention, the revolutionary assembly that in the preceding fall had abolished the monarchy completely. At the end of August 1793, the National Convention's troops had taken Marseille, but were halted before Toulon, where the Royalists had called in British forces. With the commander of the National Convention's artillery wounded, Bonaparte got post through commissioner to the army, who was a Corsican deputy and a friend of Napoleon's family. Bonaparte was promoted to major in September and then adjutant general in October. He received a bayonet wound on December 16th, but on the next day, the British troops, harassed by his artillery, evacuated Toulon. On December 22nd, Bonaparte, who was aged 24 at the time, was promoted to brigadier general in recognition of his decisive part in the capture of the town and the pushing back of the British. Augustin Robespierre, the commissioner to the army, wrote to his brother Maximilian, by then virtual head of the government and one of the leading figures in the Reign of Terror, praising the transcendent merit of the young Republican officer Bonaparte. In February 1794, Bonaparte was appointed commandant of the artillery for the French army of Italy. Robespierre fell from power in Paris on July 27, 1794. When the news reached Nice, Bonaparte, regarded as protege of Robespierre, was arrested on the charge of conspiracy and treason. He was freed in September, but was not restored in his command. The following March, he refused an offer to command the artillery of the Army of the West, which was fighting the counter-revolution in Vendée. The post seemed to hold no future for him, and he went to Paris to justify himself. Life was difficult on half pay, especially as he was carrying out an affair with Désirée Clary, the daughter of a rich Marseille businessman and sister of Julie, the bride of his elder brother Joseph. Despite his efforts in Paris, Napoleon was unable to obtain a satisfactory command because he was feared for his intense ambition and for his relations with the Montagnards, the more radical members of the National Convention. He then considered offering his services to the Sultan of Turkey at that time. Bonaparte was still in Paris in October 1795 when the National Convention, on the eve of its dispersal, submitted the new constitution of the year 3 of the First Republic to a referendum, together with decrees according to which 2/3 of the members of the National Convention were to be re-elected to the new Legislative Assembly. The Royalists, hoping that they would soon be able to restore the monarchy, instigated a revolt in Paris to prevent these measures from being put into effect. Paul Barras, who had been entrusted with dictatorial powers by the National Convention, was unwilling to rely on the commander of the troops of the interior. Instead, knowing of Bonaparte's services in Toulon, he appointed him second in command. Thus, it was Napoleon who shot down the columns of rebels marching against the National Convention, thereby saving the National Convention and the Republic. Bonaparte became the commander of the Army of the Interior and subsequently was henceforth aware of every political development in France. He became a respected advisor on military matters to the new government and the Directory. Also at this time, he came to know an attractive Creole, Josephine Tascher de La Paraine, who was the widow of General Alexander de Beauharnais, the mother of 2 children and a woman of many love affairs. From every point of view, his new life was opening up for Bonaparte. Having proved his loyalty to the Directory, he was appointed commander-in-chief of the Army of Italy in March 1796. He had been trying to obtain that post for several months so that he could personally conduct part of his plan of campaign adopted by the Directory on his advice. He married Josephine on March 9th and left for the army 2 days later. Arriving at his headquarters in Nice, Bonaparte found that his army, which on paper consisted of 43,000 men, numbered scarcely maybe 30,000 ill-fed, ill-paid, and ill-equipped men who were not trained. On March 28, 1796, he made his first proclamation to the troops. Soldiers, you are naked, badly fed. Rich provinces and great towns will be in your power, and in them you will find honor and glory and wealth. Soldiers of Italy, will you be wanting in courage and steadfastness? He took the offensive on April 12th and successfully defeated and separated the Austrian and Sardinian armies, and then marched on Turin. King Victor Amadeus of Sardinia asked for an armistice, and at the peace treaty in Paris on May 15th, Nice and Savoy, occupied the French since 1792, were annexed to France. Bonaparte continued the war against the Austrians and occupied Milan, but was held up at Mantua. While his army was besieging this great fortress, he signed armistices with Duke of Parma and the Duke of Modena, and finally Pope Pius VI. At the same time, he took an interest in the political organization of Italy. A plan for its republicanization by a group of Italian patriots led by Filippo Buonaparte had to be shelved when Buonaparte was arrested for complicity in the conspiracy against the Directory. Therefore, Bonaparte, without discarding the Italian patriots altogether, restricted their freedom of action. He set up a republican regime in Lombardy, but kept a close watch on its leaders, and in October 1796, he created the Cisalpine Republic by merging Modena and Reggio with the Papal States of Bologna and Ferrara occupied by the French army. Then he sent an expedition to recover Corsica, which the British had evacuated at the time. Austrian armies advanced 4 times from the Alps to relieve Mantua, but were defeated each time by Bonaparte, pushing them back. After the last Austrian retreat at Rivoli in January 1797, Mantua capitulated to Bonaparte. Then he marched on Vienna. He was about 60 miles from the capital when the Austrians sued for armistice. By the preliminaries of peace, Austria ceded the southern Netherlands to France and recognized the Lombard Republic, but received in exchange some territory belonging to the old Republic of Venice, which was partitioned between Austria, France, and Lombardy. Bonaparte then consolidated and reorganized the northern Italian republics and encouraged Jacobin radical republicans in Venetia. Some Italian patriots hoped that these developments would soon lead to the formation of a single and indivisible Italian republic modeled on France. Meanwhile, Bonaparte grew uneasy at the successes of the royalists in the French elections in the spring of 1797 and advised the Directory to oppose them if necessary by force. He sent General Arganu to Paris along with several officers and men to back up the coup d'etat, which eliminated the royalist friends from the government, and legislative councils that also enhanced Bonaparte's prestige in France. Thus, Bonaparte could conclude the Treaty of Campo Formio with Austria as he thought best. The Directory was displeased, however, because the treaty ceded Venice to the Austrians and did not secure the left bank of the Rhine for France. On the other hand, it raised Bonaparte's popularity to its peak, for he had gained victory for France after 5 years of war on the continent. Only the war at sea against the British continued. The directors who wanted to launch an invasion of the British Isles appointed Bonaparte to command the army assembled for this purpose. After a rapid inspection in February 1798, he announced that the operation could not be undertaken until France had command of the sea. Instead, he suggested France strike at the sources of Great Britain's wealth by occupying Egypt and threatening the route to India. This proposal, seconded by Charles Maurice, the foreign minister, was accepted by the directors, who were glad to be rid of their ambitious young general. The expedition, thanks to some fortunate coincidences, was at first a great success. Malta, the great fortress of the Hospitallers, was occupied on June 10, 1798. Then Alexandria taken by storm on July 1st, and all of the delta of the Nile rapidly overrun after that. On August 1st, however, the French squadron at anchor in Abu Qir Bay was completely destroyed by Admiral Horatio Nelson's fleet in the Battle of the Nile, so that Napoleon himself confined to the land that he had conquered. He proceeded to introduce Western political institutions, administration, and technical skills in Egypt. But Turkey, nominally a administrator over Egypt, declared war on France in September. To prevent a Turkish invasion of Egypt, and also perhaps to attempt a return to France by way of Anatolia, Bonaparte marched into Syria in February 1799. His progress northward was halted by Acre, where the British withstood a siege, and in May Bonaparte began a disastrous retreat to Egypt. The Battle of the Nile showed Europe that Bonaparte was not invincible, and Great Britain, Austria, Russia, and Turkey formed a new coalition against France. The French armies in Italy were defeated in the spring of 1799 and had to abandon the greater part of the peninsula. These defeats led to disturbances in France itself. The coup d'etat of 30 Prairial year 1799 expelled the men of moderate views from the directory and brought it into men who were considered Jacobins. Yet the situation remained confused, and one of the new directors, Emmanuel Size, was convinced that only military dictatorship could prevent a restoration of the monarchy. "I'm looking for a saber," he said. Bonaparte did not take long to make up his mind. He would leave his army and return to France in order to save the Republic. The Directory had in fact ordered his return, but he had not received the order, so that it was actually in disregard of his instructions that he left Egypt with a few companions on August 22nd, 1799. Their two frigates surprisingly escaped interception by the British, and Bonaparte arrived in Paris on October 14th. By this time, French victories in Switzerland and Holland had averted the danger of invasion. A coup d'etat could therefore no longer be justified by any need to save the Republic. From the end of October, he and Bonaparte were in league together planning a coup. And by 1799, November 9th, it was carried out. The directors were forced to resign. The members of the legislative councils were dispersed, and a new government, the consulate, was set up. The three consuls were Bonaparte and two of the directors who had resigned, Sise and Ducos. But it was Bonaparte who was henceforth the master of France. Bonaparte, now 30 years old, was thin and short and wore his hair cut close. Not much was known about his personality, but people had confidence in the man who had always been victorious in the Nile and in Italy, as an example. He was indeed exceptionally intelligent, prompt to make decisions, and hardworking, but also insatiably ambitious. He seemed to be the man of the revolution because it was due to the revolution that he had climbed at so early an age to the highest place in the state. He was not to forget it, but more than any man of the revolution, he was the man of the 18th century, the most enlightened of despots, the true son of Voltaire. He did not believe in the sovereignty of the people, in the popular will, or in the parliamentary debate. Yet he put his confidence more in reasoning than in reason, and may be said to have preferred men of talent, mathematicians, jurists, and statesmen, for instance, however cynical or mercenary that he might be, to technicians, or the true sense of the word. He believed that an enlightened and firm will could do anything if it had its support of its bayonets. He despised and feared the masses, and for the public opinion he considered he could mold and direct it as he pleased. He has been called the most civilian of generals, but essentially he never ceased to be a soldier. Bonaparte imposed a dictatorship on France, but its true nature was at first disguised in a constitution that was passed in December of 1799, drawn up by Sise. The Constitution did not guarantee the rights of man or make any mention of liberty or equality or fraternity, but it did reassure the partisans of the revolution by proclaiming the irrevocability of sale of national property and by upholding the legislation against immigrants. It gave immense powers to the first consul, leaving only a nominal role to the other two colleagues. The first consul, namely Bonaparte, was to appoint ministers, generals, servants, magistrates, and members of the Council of State, and was to have an overwhelming influence in the choice of members of all three legislative assemblies. The Constitution won an overwhelming majority in February of 1800. The consulate's work of administrative reform undertaken by Bonaparte's instigation was to be more lasting than the Constitution and more important to France. At the head of the government was the Council of State, created by a first consul and often effectively presiding over by him. It was to play an important role in both the source of new legislation and an administrative tribunal. So essentially, this body he was creating would both pass the laws and administer the laws. The judicial system was profoundly changed, whereas from the beginning of the revolution, judges had been elected, henceforth they were to be nominated by government, their independence assured by their non-removability from office. The police organization was greatly strengthened. The financial administration was considerably improved. Instead of municipalities, special officials were entrusted with collecting of direct taxes. The franc was stabilized. The Bank of France, owned partly by shareholders and partly by the state, was also created. Education was transformed into major public service. Secondary education was given a semi-military organization, and the university's facilities were and the university faculties were established. Primary education, however, was still neglected. The codification of the civil law, first undertaken in 1790, was at last completed under the consulate under Bonaparte. The code, finally passed in 1804, later known as the Napoleonic Code, gave permanent form to the great gains of the Revolution: individual liberty, freedom of work, freedom of conscience, the lay character of the state, and equality before law. But at the same time, it protected landed property, gave greater liberty to employers, showed little concern for employees. It maintained divorce, but granted only limited rights to women. The army received the most careful attention. The first consul retained in the outline of the system instituted by the Revolution recruitment by forced conscription if needed, with the possibility of replacement by substitutes. The mixing of the conscripts with the old soldiers, and the eligibility for all for promotion to the highest ranks. Nevertheless, creation of the Académie Saint-Cyr to produce infantry officer made it easier for the sons of the bourgeois families to pursue a military career. The first consul spent the winter and spring 1799 to 1800 reorganizing the army and preparing for an attack by Austria, Russia having withdrawn from the anti-French coalition. With his usual quick assessment of the situation, he saw strategic importance of the Swiss Confederation, from which he would be free to outflank the Austrian armies either in Germany or Italy. His past successes had made him choose Italy. Taking his army across the great St. Bernard Pass before the snow melted, he appeared unexpectedly behind Austrian armies besieging Genoa. The Battle of Marengo in June gave French command of Po Valley as well as Ardurgo, and in December another French army defeated Austrians in Germany. Austria was forced to sign the Treaty of Luneville in February 1801, whereby France's right to national frontiers that Julius Caesar had given to Gaul, namely the Rhine, the Alps, and the Pyrenees, was now recognized. Great Britain alone remained at war with France, but it soon tired of the struggle. Preliminaries of peace, concluded in London in October 1801, put an end to hostilities between England and France, and the peace was signed on March 27, 1802. General peace was reestablished in Europe, and the first consul's prestige increased even more, as his friends, at his suggestion, proposed that a token of national gratitude should be offered to him. In May 1802, it was decided that the French people should vote in a referendum on the following question: shall Napoleon Bonaparte be consul for life? In August, an overwhelming vote granted him the prolongation of the consulate as his well right and designate for his survivor. Bonaparte's conception of international peace differed from that of the British. The British often hoped to take back some of the concessions they had been forced to make. For Bonaparte, on the other hand, the Treaty of Amiens marked the starting point of a new French ascendancy. He was first of all intent on reserving half of Europe as a market for France, without lowering custom duties, to the indignation of British merchants. To revive France's expansion overseas, he also intended to recover Saint-Domingue, to occupy Louisiana in the United States, perhaps to reconquer Egypt, and at any rate to extend French influence in the Mediterranean and Indian Oceans. In continental Europe, he advanced beyond France's natural borders, incorporating Piedmont into France, imposing a more centralized government on the Swiss Confederation and in Germany. So you can see the amount of expansionism that he was thinking of. This is after he had created tremendous peace in Europe for 2 years. All of a sudden, he was thinking more and more expansion. Great Britain was alarmed by the expansion of France in peacetime and found it scarcely tolerable that one state should command the coastline of the continent from Genoa to Antwerp. In addition, Napoleon for the first time was thinking about his possible invasion of Russia and the East. In the hope of consolidating his own position, Fouché now suggested to Bonaparte that the best way to discourage conspiracy would be to transform the life consulate into a hereditary empire which, because of the fact there would be an heir, would remove all hope of changing the regime by assassination. Bonaparte readily accepted this suggestion, and on May 18, 1804, the empire was proclaimed. Though there was little change in the organization of government in France, Napoleon, as emperor, revived a number of institutions similar to those of the old regime. In the first place, he wanted to be consecrated by the Pope himself, so that his coronation would be even more impressive than that of the kings of France. Pius VII agreed to come to Paris, and in the ceremony, which seemed equally outrageous to royalists and to old soldiers of the Revolution, took place in Notre Dame in December 2nd, 1804. At the last moment, the emperor took the crown from the Pope and set it on his own head himself. The imperial regime also instituted its symbols and titles. Princely titles were brought back for the members of the Napoleonic family, and an imperial nobility was created in 1808. As opposition is still lively, Napoleon intensified his propaganda and imposed an increasingly strict censorship on the press. A dictatorial regime allowed him to carry on his wars for years without worrying about the French public opinion. Having been president on the Italian Republic since January 1802, Napoleon in March 1805 was proclaimed King of Italy and crowned in Milan in May as well. From 1803 to 1805, Napoleon had only the British to fight, and again France could only hope for victory by landing an army in the British Isles, whereas the British could defeat Napoleon only by forming a continental coalition against him on mainland Europe. Napoleon began to prepare an invasion again, this time with greater conviction and a larger scale. He gathered nearly 2,000 ships between Brest and Antwerp and concentrated his grand army in the camp at Boulogne in 1803. Even so, the problem was the same as in 1798. To cross the Channel, the French had to have control of the sea. Still far inferior to the British Navy, the French fleet needed the help of the Spanish, and even then, two fleets together could not hope to defeat more than one of the British squadrons. Spain was induced to declare war on Great Britain in December 1804, and it was decided that the French and Spanish squadrons massed in the Antilles should lure a British squadron into those waters and defeat it, thus making the balance roughly equal between Franco-Spanish Navy and British. A battle in the entrance to the Channel could then be fought with some success. The plan actually failed. The French squadron from the Mediterranean under Admiral Villeneuve found itself alone at the appointed meeting place in the Antilles. Pursued by Nelson and not daring to attack him, it turned back towards Europe and took refuge in Cadiz in 1805. There the British blockaded it. Accused of cowardice by the angry Napoleon, Villeneuve resolved to run the blockade with the support of a Spanish squadron. On October 21st, 1805, he was attacked by Nelson off of Cape Trafalgar. Nelson was killed in battle, but the Franco-Spanish fleet was totally destroyed and all sunk. The British had won a decisive victory, which eliminated the danger of British invasion by the French. By 1810, Napoleon's fortunes were at their zenith. Despite some failures in Spain and Portugal, he considered himself Charlemagne's heir. He repudiated Josephine, who had not given him a child, so that he could marry Marie Louise, daughter of the Austrian Empire Francis I. The birth of a son, the King of Rome, in March 1811 seemed to assure the future of his empire, now at its greatest extent, including not only the Pyrenees provinces, but also Etruria, which is now Tuscany, some of the Papal States, Holland, and German states bordering the North Sea. The empire was surrounded by a ring of vassal states ruled over by the emperor's relatives: the Kingdom of Westphalia, the Kingdom of Spain, the Kingdom of Italy, the Kingdom of Naples, and the Principality of Lucca and Pombiano. Other territories were closely bound to the empire by treaties: the Confederation of the Rhine and the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. Even Austria seemed bound to France by Napoleon's marriage to Marie Louise. So you can see in these early days, as he consolidated his power and as he got to the zenith of his power, was very unchallenged by most countries and really done a great job, both militarily in his many battles, some of which he won, some of which he lost, but largely the destination was taking over most of Europe. and he was able to consolidate his power in all those different countries, only to then later in life be deposed by those who were very violently against his autocratic ways. And eventually he got pushed out of office and then sent to the island of St Helena. And we'll get into some details about all of that, how that came to pass and how he ended up losing his power. So let's go ahead and take a look at the video, and we'll come back and talk about it on the other side.
On August 1769, in the small island of Corsica, Napoleon Bonaparte was born. His family were members of the Corsican nobility, but their family was not wealthy. Napoleon attended school in the mainland of France. In 1785, he later went on to graduate from a French military academy. He joined the French army, eventually rising to the rank of second lieutenant. In 1789, the French Revolution had begun, and within a period of 3 years, the revolutionaries had overthrown the monarchs. France was declared a French republic. Early in the revolution, Napoleon was on leave from the army and back home in Corsica. It was there that he joined a pro-democracy group called the Jacobins. In 1793, Napoleon and his family were forced to flee Corsica after having a political fallout with the governor. He returned to the mainland of France and returned to the French military. During this period of time, Napoleon befriended a man named Augustin Robespierre, the brother of the infamous Maximilien Robespierre. Maximilien Robespierre was a Jacobin who was instrumental in the Reign of Terror. This was a period of 2 years in France, where members of the bourgeoisie, and really anyone who was suspected of being an enemy of the revolution, was getting executed. During this time, Napoleon rose to the rank of brigadier general. In 1794, Maximilien Robespierre and his brother Augustin were both guillotined. Napoleon was put on house arrest due to past connections with the brothers. The overthrow of the French monarchy birthed fear into the hearts of many European kings and queens. After all, if democracy revealed itself to be better than a monarchy in France, then it might embolden the proletariat classes in other countries. This led France to engage in military conflicts with many other of these European countries. In 1796, Napoleon, with far fewer forces, defeated one of France's greatest rivals, Austria. Within a year, the conflict ended, with the Treaty of Camp Formio, which led to France's increase in territory. Since 1795, France had been ruled by a 5-person council called the Directory. After Napoleon defeated the Austrians in 1797, the Directory gave him the offer to invade England. He refused the offer, claiming that the French naval forces couldn't handle the British Royal Navy. Instead, he decided to invade Egypt, so he could eventually cut off the British trade routes to India. At the Battle of the Pyramids in July 1798, Napoleon's forces defeated the Egyptian forces, also known as the Mamluks. Unfortunately for him, the French fleet was burned by the British Royal Navy at the Battle of the Nile in August 1798, and as a result of this, Napoleon's army was stranded. In early 1799, Napoleon decided to invade modern-day Syria, which at the time was owned by the Ottoman Empire. It ended with a failed siege of Acre, which is located in modern-day Israel. Now at this point, Napoleon was in a sticky situation, but he noticed that back home in France, there was political instability. He made the daring decision to abandon his army in Egypt and to return to France. The Directory had grown unpopular, and in 1799, Napoleon, along with others, staged a coup, which became known as the Coup of 18 Brumaire. The 5-member Directory was replaced with a 3-member consulate. A consul is something like a president, so basically they had 3 presidents. Napoleon, however, became the first consul, meaning that it was at this point that Napoleon was the most powerful political figure in all of France. In June of 1800, Napoleon once again defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Marengo. This victory helped secure his position as the first consul. In 1802, the British signed the Treaty of Amiens with France. This led to a period of peace between the two countries for about a year. Napoleon realized that France had gone through many revolutions and much political turmoil in the past century. He decided to restore stability to France by centralizing the government. He also instituted reforms in banking and education. He subsidized the arts and sciences and also squashed his beef with the Pope. This was relevant since France was primarily Catholic. Perhaps his most important contribution during this time was the Napoleonic Code. The Napoleonic Code was a set of laws that clearly laid out what was legal and illegal with regards to property, individual rights, colonial affairs, and family. In 1802, he made a major move to consolidate his power. A constitutional amendment was passed that made Napoleon first consul for life. Fast forward 2 years later, and Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France. The period of time between 1803 to 1815 is marked by the Napoleonic Wars. You can probably guess why it's called that. In 1803, mainly in order to raise money for future wars, Napoleon famously sold his French territory in North America to US President Thomas Jefferson for a grand total of $15 million in what's now known as the Louisiana Purchase. In October of 1805, the British Royal Navy again destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar. 2 months later, however, Napoleon achieved what many consider to be his greatest victory at the Battle of Austerlitz, also known as the Battle of Three Emperors. Napoleon managed to defeat the much larger forces of the Russians, the Austrians, and also the Holy Roman Empire. Napoleon defeated the Holy Roman Empire so badly that it dissolved and turned into the Confederation of the Rhine. These were smaller states located in modern-day Germany that had to provide troops and supplies to Napoleon for his future conquests. This region also served as a buffer from two of France's greatest enemies to the east, the Austrians and the Prussians. Napoleon had been screwed over by the British on several occasions, and he knew from a very young age that a direct confrontation with the British Royal Navy would surely lead to defeat. Napoleon decided that it was time for a new tactic, so he devised the Continental System. This was a large-scale economic attack on the British. Basically, allies of France, and even those that were neutral in the British-French conflict, were not to trade with the British. In 1807, Napoleon dealt a severe blow to the Russians at Friedland, Prussia. It was so bad that the Russian monarch Alexander I was forced to sign a peace agreement called the Treaty of Tilsit. In 1809, Napoleon defeated the Austrians again at the Battle of Wagram. Once again, he increased the size of the French Empire. Now let's discuss the downfall of Napoleon. In case you forgot, Napoleon instituted the Continental System in order to put economic pressure on the British. The Continental System forbid French allies and even neutrals from trading with the British. In 1810, the Russians pulled out of the Continental System. This enraged Napoleon, and in the summer of 1812, he decided to invade Russia. Many believe this decision was the beginning of the end for the emperor. Every time the French got to a city, it was already evacuated. Not only that, but they would set fires across the cities to burn the resources within that city. This tactic is known as a scorched earth policy. The French were forced to dive deeper and deeper into the harsh, cold Russian lands, but they were not prepared for such a long campaign. In September of 1812, the French engaged the British in the Battle of Borodino, in which both sides suffered great casualties. Eventually, Napoleon marched on the Russian capital, Moscow, but to his dismay, the Russians had already evacuated their own city. Napoleon waited for a whole month for the Russians to surrender, but they didn't. He realized he didn't have the resources to withstand the deadly Russian winter, so he began to retreat from Moscow on a horrible journey. The French had around 600,000 troops at the beginning of this terrible trek, but by the end of this journey, only 100,000 had survived. While Napoleon was suffering defeat at the hands of the Russians, the Spanish, Portuguese, and British teamed up to drive French forces out of the Iberian Peninsula. In 1813, in the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations, Prussian, Swedish, Austrian, and Russian forces teamed up to defeat Napoleon. He was forced to retreat to France, and in March 1814, this coalition of forces captured the capital of France, Paris. In April 1814, Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne. The Treaty of Fontainebleau was signed between Napoleon and members of Austria, Russia, and Prussia, and it ended the war and required Napoleon to be exiled to the small island Elba. He tried to make a small comeback a year later. He escaped the island and returned to the mainland of France with over 1,000 supporters. He returned to Paris, and the monarch, King Louis XVIII, ran. He began what is known as the 100 Days Campaign. He started off by rallying together a small army. He planned on taking out each of his foes one by one, rather than fighting a giant coalition as he did before. He started off by invading Belgium in July 1815. It just so happened that both the British and Prussians had troops stationed there. Nonetheless, Napoleon was victorious at the Battle of Ligny. His success, however, did not last long. 2 days later, at the Battle of Waterloo, the British and Prussians destroyed his army. Once again, Napoleon was forced to give up his power. This time, he was exiled to the British-controlled island, St Helena. He remained there for 5 years, and he eventually died from health issues. He's encrypted in a tomb in Paris. Although Napoleon identified as a child of the Enlightenment, he did several things that contradicted Enlightenment values. He re-established slavery in Haiti, which was a French colony during his reign. During his time as emperor, he re-established an aristocracy and handed out titles of nobility to friends and followers. And perhaps the most obvious example of hypocrisy, he was a dictator. In 1799, during Napoleon's military campaign in Egypt, a French soldier discovered the Rosetta Stone. This artifact allowed us to discover the meaning behind many Egyptian hieroglyphics. No one understood the meaning of this language for close to 2,000 years. This period of time is incredibly interesting, as it's one of many revolutions that started out with the overthrow of a tyrannical, inept system of government. The masses agreed to overthrow a vicious, inept dictator in favor of a better system, only to end up back in a similar situation.
So as you can see, Napoleon really had a tough start to life. Not only grew up in Corsica, but then had befriended the Robespierre brothers, and that got him into some real hot trouble there for a while, and ended up getting put behind bars, ended up getting what they thought was completely marginalized and put away. But then, of course, he made a huge comeback when he came back to France, almost as a returning hero, and came back and rejoined the military and started his ascendancy again. But really unbelievable start to his life there. Really could have gone in a different direction, but he was able to recover it, able to recover his reputation and get back on track in the military and prove himself in many different battles to come. His rise continued almost every single year from 1796 all the way through 1811. Those 15 years were one of the biggest ascendancies Europe has ever seen, for somebody to go from a low-level officer all the way up to the Emperor of France, and to then consolidate all of Europe under one flag, essentially, and that was France. Only place he was truly unable to capture was Russia and England. England because of the physical problems and the naval superiority of England, but also Russia because of the winters and because of the large territory that he would have had to conquer. Similar to Hitler, many years later in World War II, he found that Russia was uncapturable because of the weather and because of the territory, and because of how large the territory was. So really interesting there, as you saw in the video, how incredible this rise was, and of course the tremendous fall at the end. But he had made his mark, and as we mentioned earlier in the program, was one of the most consequential individuals in our world history, and definitely the most consequential figure in the 17 and 1800s. So let's go ahead. We're going to take a quick look at some of the clips from the great movie Napoleon, which if you haven't seen that movie, I highly recommend you take a look at it. It's really fantastic, well acted, and some of the battle scenes especially are really worth watching if you like war movies. So let's go ahead and take a look.
Ready the cannons.
Ready the cannons! Prepare to fire! 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 Leave your head down!
receive cavalry.
Infantry advance!
So you can see there in the battle scene, that was Waterloo, which of course was Napoleon's biggest defeat of his career and really ended his military career. It wasn't that long after that that he was ended up pushed out of power in Paris. And eventually he was a prisoner on St Helena Island for the last 5 years of his life. And it was kind of pushed into captivity in shame after Waterloo and after some of the last battle campaigns he had done. So really pretty incredible that that's how his life and his career ended, when he had had so much success through most of his life, and really kind of a tragic ending, a tragic figure at the end there. Really some amazing scenes you can see there. Joaquin Phoenix is the actor who plays Napoleon, does a fantastic job of capturing his personality, of capturing many scenes in it that you would have seen back then if you really were watching Napoleon and his career, both young and old. So highly recommend you check that movie out. It's really good for people who love history and people who love military war movies. And you'll learn a lot. You'll see a lot of the major battles of his career and how they really went down, both of his victories and some of his defeats. So highly recommend you check it out. Let's go ahead and take a look at the 25 little known facts about Napoleon. So number one, Napoleon Bonaparte had formal military training. As a teen, he attended the prestigious École Militaire in Paris. But when his father died his first year there, the younger Bonaparte, whose name was actually Napoleon de Bonaparte, before he changed it as a young adult to sound more French, was forced to graduate early to help his family financially. Cutting his studies short caused Napoleon's grades to suffer, and he ended up graduating 42nd in a class of 58 students. He did, however, earn the distinction of being the first Corsican to graduate from the École Militaire. At 16 years old, Napoleon became an officer in the French army. So think about how astounding that was. At 16, he already had multiple years of military training and became an officer. Really quite an incredible accomplishment on his part. You can see a picture of Napoleon there as a very young officer on his horse as he joined the French military. Number two, young Napoleon was a Corsican nationalist. We mentioned this a little bit earlier in the program. Napoleon was single-handedly responsible for and synonymous with the First French Empire. But as a young man, he longed to see his homeland overthrow the French rule. His parents had opposed French rule since before he was born, and during his youth, Napoleon wrote a series of treatises on the history and government of Corsica, in which he called French monsters, who are said to be enemies of free men. In the late 1780s and early 1790s, Napoleon returned to Corsica for long stretches, avoiding the early stages of the French Revolution. But during these visits home, he was struck with how provincial the island was and how much bigger the world at large seemed in comparison. His mannerisms and preoccupations were becoming more and more French. Meanwhile, the Corsican governor and former idol to young Napoleon, Pasquale Paoli, became increasingly anglicized. Ultimately, it was a clash between the Bonaparte family and Paoli that inspired Napoleon to leave Corsica once and for all and to leave for France. You see a great picture there of young Napoleon in his Corsican uniform, not his French uniform, but Corsican, and his Corsican flag. Number three, Napoleon's wife, Josephine de Beauharnais, barely escaped execution. You see a picture of her there on the right. Born into plantation-owning family in Martinique, Josephine married French aristocracy when she was wed to Alexandre de Beauharnais at the age of 16. Although her husband wanted nothing to do with her, she seduced and charmed other high society men. But that didn't save her from imprisonment in Les Carmes as the French Revolution swept through Paris. Her estranged husband was sent to the guillotine, but the day before her trial, the government was deposed and executions halted. So she got really lucky by one day. Having just barely escaped with her life, Josephine quickly became a popular socialite, eventually meeting Napoleon at a party in 1795. She was 32 and established in French society. He was just 26, shy and inexperienced. At their wedding 6 months later, she reportedly knocked 4 years off her age on their marriage certificate, and he added 18 months to his, which made them seem to be the same age on paper. It's pretty interesting that they both lied on their marriage certificate so that they looked like they were the same age. Number four, Napoleon probably never said, "Not tonight, Josephine." See a great picture there of Napoleon and his wife, Josephine, on the top and also on the bottom down there. Of course, we can't know everything the couple said to one another in private, but judging from the letters between the two, Napoleon was desperately infatuated with his wife and expressed an insecure neediness that, if anything, put her off intimacy. The young general embarked on his Italian campaign just a few days into the couple's marriage, writing to her almost constantly from the battlefield. For her part, Josephine seems to have struck up affairs back in France in her husband's absence. And her silence drove him to send increasingly pleading missives. So you can see he was very insecure when it came to Josephine, knowing that in French culture back then, there was lots of affairs going on. And of course, he was away all the time in his various military campaigns. Number five, Napoleon was not actually short. The rumor about Napoleon's height or lack thereof started during his lifetime by his enemies. English propagandists depicted the general as comically diminutive in critical cartoons during the Napoleonic Wars. The belief became so deeply established and ingrained that in the 20th century, a psychological complex specific to short men was named after him. And of course, that's the Napoleon syndrome. But how tall was he really? Documents show he was around 5'6", which was actually average for the era. So he wasn't really short. That height comes from what was written at the time of his death. A physician's note that accompanied Napoleon's coffin says he was 5 feet 2 inches from the top of his head to his heels. But an additional note specifies that this is French measurements and that is equal to 5 feet 6 inches in English terms. So you can see he really was about average height, and that the rumor was made upon him that was actually untrue, that he was short. Number 6, Napoleon wrote a romance novel. Napoleon Bonaparte was a general, a revolutionary, an emperor, and on at least one occasion, a romance novelist. And you can see a copy of the first page of his romance novel there on the right. Written just before he met and married Josephine in 1795, Clisson et Eugénie tells a fictionalized account of a young soldier's relationship with Bernardine Eugénie Désirée Clary, whose sister married his brother Joseph. The novel was never published during his lifetime, and following his death, the manuscript was divided into segments that sold as souvenirs at auction houses in centuries after. The complete English translation was not constructed until 2009. If you're interested in reading the tale of passionate lovers separated by war and ultimately death, you can find Clisson et Eugénie. You can find it in bookstores or on Amazon. So it actually is for sale if you'd like to read Napoleon's romance novel. Number 7, Napoleon's army discovered the Rosetta Stone. Napoleon is best remembered for his political and military prowess, but during his early life, he also considered himself a scientist and was elected to the National Institute, the leading French scientific society, in 1797. For his expedition to seize Egypt and thus cut off British trade route, Napoleon brought along 150 savants, scientists, engineers, and scholars to survey the topography, environment, culture, and history of Egypt, in addition to his troops. The 23-volume Description l'Egypte introduced Europeans to the country, but perhaps the greatest find was the Rosetta Stone. Captain Pierre-François Xavier Bouchard discovered the inscribed slab during the demolition of an ancient wall in the city of Rosetta. He immediately recognized the potential significance and had the stone shipped to Cairo. Written in hieroglyphic and Greek script, the stone eventually helped scholars crack ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. You can see a picture there on the bottom of the Rosetta Stone, and of course on the top is a depiction of Napoleon Bonaparte as he's looking at the Sphinx in Egypt. So that incredible stone on the bottom right there was discovered by he and his men. Number 8, Beethoven planned to dedicate his Third Symphony to Napoleon. Ludwig von Beethoven greatly admired the general, even into Napoleon's early years as first consul, after overthrowing the existing government. When he began working on Symphony No. 3, Beethoven professed to be inspired by Napoleon's heroic exploits and ostensibly democratic ideals. But in 1804, after declaring himself first consul for life, Napoleon had himself crowned emperor, and Beethoven lost all respect for him at that time. According to Fernandez Rees, one of the composer's students, Beethoven flew into a rage and cried out, "Is he too then nothing more than an ordinary human being? Now he too will trample on the rights of man and indulge only his ambition?" Beethoven went to the table, took hold of the title page by the top, and tore it in two and threw it on the floor. So you can imagine Beethoven, the picture there on the top left, and how he was feeling after he realized that Napoleon was not the great democratic ideal leader that he thought he was, but it was in fact someone who wanted to be in power for life, and decided not to dedicate his Symphony No. 3 to him. Number 9, Napoleon's empire attempted to spread religious tolerance. As a child, Napoleon was baptized Catholic, but his own writings indicate that he began to question Catholicism and indeed the existence of any God early in his life. While Napoleon lacked a strong personal faith, he admired the tactical power of organized religion. Following his initial ascent to power in France, he set about reestablishing the Catholic Church that had been all but dismantled during the Revolution. He recognized Catholicism as the religion of the vast majority of French citizens, and brought the church under the authority of the state. As emperor, Napoleon emancipated Jews in areas of Europe under his control, insisting that they be free to own property and worship freely. Following his Egyptian expedition, some scholars believe Napoleon was particularly fascinated by Mohammed and Islam, and believed all faiths should be welcome in the empire. So really interesting that he had such an autocratic nature, wanted to be in power for life, wanted to control everything. But the one thing he was very liberal on in terms of tolerance was for all religions to be able to be freely practiced in his empire. Number 10, Napoleon attempted suicide before exile on Elba. Following a disastrous campaign in Russia and pressures from the Sixth Coalition, Napoleon was forced to abdicate as part of the Treaty of Fontainebleau on April 11, 1814, although he would at first be sentenced to live out a comfortable life as sovereign on the island of Elba. Napoleon's first reaction to his exile was a suicide attempt while still at Fontainebleau. He had been carrying a poisonous pill with him ever since the failure in Russia and finally took it on April 12th, but the pill must have lost its potency with age. While it made Napoleon violently ill, it did not kill him. So pretty incredible that he couldn't live with this idea of being a comfortable life as sovereign of the island of Elba, but essentially being forced into exile. He just couldn't handle the idea of that. And so he went ahead and took a suicide pill, which did not work. So pretty interesting. Number 11, Britain's Prince Regent worried that the English people would rally around Napoleon. You can see a picture there on the right of Prince Regent from England. Following his escape from Elba and his brief return to power, Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo, and we saw some video of the movie there, the Battle of Waterloo, when he returned to power. He was forced to surrender to the British captain of the HMS Bellefonds. Napoleon drafted a letter to the Britain's Prince Regent, who was the future King George IV, requesting asylum and a small estate outside of London, which was a bold request considering his years of plotting to conquer England. The letter was never delivered, but it likely wouldn't have mattered. Parliament was concerned that Napoleon, a charismatic foreign dictator, would be so popular with the British people that lawmakers refused to even let him disembark or come to England at all. Instead, he remained on board the anchored Bellefonds, and crowds flocked to catch a glimpse of him until he was banished to St Helena, where he lived out his last 5 years. It's really interesting. They were really worried about him and scared of him that he would become very popular like he was in France for most of his life. Number 12, attempts to liberate Napoleon from St Helena included submarines. You can see a couple great pictures there, one on the top left of his prison up at the very top of the mountain on St Helena. You can see how hard it would have been to get to that prison up there where he was living the last 5 years, and some ships down below. And then there's a picture on the bottom left there of what the little estate looked like that he lived out his last 5 years on Helena in exile. The British took extreme caution in securing Napoleon's final exile location. St Helena, which was a volcanic island in the South Atlantic, is located and isolated, ringed with steep cliffs, was guarded by some 2,800 men armed with 500 cannons. The seas around the tiny island were constantly patrolled by an entire Royal Navy squadron consisting of 11 ships, and even a separate island 1,200 miles further out in the Atlantic was stocked with further garrisons to prevent a rescue attempt from South America. They were right to be concerned. During Napoleon's last 6 years of life on St. Helena, escape plans included boats, balloons, and even a pair of primitive submarines. Notorious British smuggler Tom Johnson claimed that in 1820, he was offered £40,000 to rescue the emperor. He hatched a scheme to do so that included a pair of ships with collapsible masts that could sneak up to the island fully submerged, and with a boatswain's chair to scale the cliffs. So you can just imagine this plot to try to rescue him with these two submersible submarines back in 1820. Pretty incredible. Number 13, supporters built a house for Napoleon in New Orleans, Louisiana. Nicolas Giraud, the fifth mayor of New Orleans, was an avid supporter of Napoleon. Following the abdication at Waterloo, Giraud helped members of Napoleon's Imperial Guard escape to the United States. But he also had plans for the emperor himself to move to the city. In 1821, Giraud, who had retired from mayoral office, began renovating a home on the corner of Chartres and St. Louis streets, which he claimed would be Napoleon's residence after an intended rescue mission by Dominique You. When Napoleon died later that same year, Giraud moved his own family into the building, but even today it is known as the Napoleon House. And you can see a picture there of the Napoleon House there in downtown New Orleans on the top right, and then a picture of the front sign on the bottom left there of the Napoleon House, which is still a very highly visited place by tourists who like to go and be near this building that was built for Napoleon, where he never ended up living. Number 14, Napoleon likely died of stomach cancer, not arsenic poisoning. Napoleon died on May 5th, 1821 at the age of 51, while still in exile on St Helena. At the same time, his personal physician reported on the death certificate that the emperor had died of stomach cancer, consistent with reports that he suffered from abdominal pain and nausea in the last weeks of his life. But his body remained remarkably well preserved, a common side effect of arsenic poisoning, inspiring 2 centuries of speculation about foul play and many conspiracy theories. In 1961, elevated levels of arsenic were detected in samples of Napoleon's hair, fueling these rumors even further. Even if he wasn't assassinated in that way, some theories suggested perhaps he was accidentally poisoned by the fumes created by the arsenic in his bedroom wallpaper and the damp atmosphere on St. Helena. It's really interesting that we don't fully know how he died or why he died, and whether it was suicide or whether it was assassination or whether it was natural causes, or whether he maybe was living in a house that had dangerous levels of arsenic. You can see some great pictures there on the bottom of the procession and funeral that was planned and executed and carried out in Paris, France, with many, many onlookers there. And then you can see the funeral procession carrying his casket and body on the bottom right with all the French flags. Number 15, not content with military glory, Napoleon sought power right at the top of the French Empire. After the ruling government of France began to lose control in 1799, Napoleon saw his chance to aim for the top job. In 1804, he formed a new government called the Consulate and was appointed himself first consul, which was essentially emperor for life. Pope Pius VII crowned him Emperor of France at the coronation held in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris in December 1804, although it is recorded that Napoleon insisted on placing the crown on his head himself, rather than have Pope Pius VII do it. You see a famous picture there on the bottom right of him grabbing the crown from the Pope, who was supposed to place it on his head, and actually placing it on his own head in that ceremony. And you can see a fantastic rendering at the time of Notre Dame in Paris, up on the top right. Number 16, during his rule, Napoleon championed equality and oversaw a modern empire. Napoleon established a number of reforms designed to modernize France during his reign. He brought in the Napoleonic Code, which stated that government positions would be filled on the basis of the people's qualifications and abilities, rather than their status of birth or religion. You see, this was a tremendous revolution in Europe, that merit-based positions would be filled rather than based on what family you were born into, what your religion was, or what your status was. This is a very similar type of movement that was happening in the United States, of course, with the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence that were stating that they wanted to establish a government by the people, for the people. So this was a similar idea that Napoleon was putting in place for the French people. It was a merit-based society, which was a radical idea at the time. He also built new roads, infrastructure, and promoted commerce. He set up non-religious schools so more French children could access education. You see some great pictures there of Napoleon with his men on ships, and then greeting his men in the different dignitaries in France. Number 17, most of Napoleon's time as emperor was spent fighting military campaigns. Thanks to Napoleon Bonaparte's expertise in military planning, France controlled most of Europe by 1811. In 1812, he set his sights on invading Russia, having already defeated the Russian and Austrian armies at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805. By 1813, however, Europe was turning against France, and his control was rapidly slipping away. He abdicated as emperor in 1814 and was forced into exile on the Isle of Elba, close to the Tuscan coast in Italy. Some great epic pictures there of Napoleon in his various battles that he fought over the years. Number 18, Napoleon Bonaparte's 100 Days in Paris. By March 1815, Napoleon had escaped from Elba, gathered his forces, and returned to Paris, where he managed to retain control for a period known as 100 Days. During this time, he reclaimed his title as Emperor Napoleon. His victory did not last long, however. In June of the same year, Napoleon was defeated by the English and Prussian forces, led by Wellington and Blücher, at the Battle of Waterloo. And of course, that Battle of Waterloo being his real defeat at the end of his career. You see a great picture of it there in the top center. And this essentially ended his military career and ended his reign as emperor. You heard the term throughout the history and throughout the years where people say this was your Waterloo. And what that means to Napoleon and to anyone is that this was your downfall. This was the end of your reign. This was the end of your success. This was your Waterloo. Number 19, he would disguise himself and walk the streets. At the height of his powers, Napoleon developed the habit of dressing up as a lower-class bourgeoisie and wandering the streets of Paris. Seemingly, his aim was to find out what the man on the street really thought of him, and what he reportedly quizzed random passersby about their emperor's merits. See a picture there on the top right of Napoleon with one of his men. They would dress up in just regular clothes and walk around and talk to people and kind of get the lay of the land and get the pulse of the people. Another item here, he was also tone deaf. Apparently one of Napoleon's least endearing habits was his penchant for singing or humming or mumbling whenever he became agitated. Unfortunately, pained accounts suggest that his singing voice was distinctly unmusical and he could not hit a note to save his life. And you saw in that clip we showed from the movie Napoleon, you saw at the end of that scene as his troops were losing very badly to the British, he was humming and singing almost the whole time at the end of that. And that really was true. That's what he did. That was his nervous habit that he would do when he was agitated or nervous or angry in some way. He would sing or hum to the annoyance of everybody around him. Number 20, Napoleon helped solidify driving on the right side of the road. And we mentioned this a little bit in the opening tonight. Riders across continental Europe rode on the left side of the road specifically so they could wield a sword or a weapon from their right hand. It was also considered safer to mount and dismount a horse from the side of the road. Also, nobility rode on the left, pushing the poor folk to the right of the road. So after the French Revolution, aristocrats got the idea to pass on the right in order to blend in with the peasants and escape detection. In 1709 in Russia, Peter the Great recognized the custom, and Empress Elizabeth made an official edict in 1752. But Napoleon decided to change road traffic to the right to surprise the enemy. This new way quickly spread among his conquests and was adopted across Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Germany, Poland, and across many areas of Italy and Spain. Britain, Portugal, and Austro-Hungarian Empire resisted and stayed driving on the left. But you can see the impact of Napoleon was so widespread over his 25 years of impact that almost the entire world now drives on the right side of the road. And you can see a map to the top right up there of all of the countries that drive on the right side. It's essentially 95% of the world. With the blue areas of the world there, you see still driving on the left side. So Napoleon made a humongous impact on the way we live life today by having most of us drive on the right side of the road. 21, he was once beaten by a chess-playing automaton designed and built by Wolfgang von Kempelen. The automaton was known as the Turk, or the thinking machine, and purported to be able to defeat humans at chess. It came complete with a seated, life-size wooden man dressed in the garb of a magi or a sorcerer, as most European audiences imagined them to look. The figure sat at a cabinet with a chessboard on top. In 1809, Napoleon played against the machine. Cosmos magazine best describes the match this way. As usual, the Turk was soon in a commanding position. The emperor attempted an illegal move. The Turk replaced the piece onto its proper square. Napoleon tried another illegal move. This time, the Turk removed the offending piece from the board entirely. Amused by this, Napoleon attempted a third illegal move. The Turk swept his arm across the board, knocking over all the pieces to Napoleon's delight. And you see a picture there of the Magi sitting at the board with the table in front of him. It was discovered later, though, that a master chess player was hidden inside the cabinet. And this invention was all just a hoax for entertainment purposes and for propaganda purposes. So pretty funny that Napoleon fell for this, and many, many people fell for this as a real chess-playing automaton. 22, his second wife was Frances, shot at unity with Austria. Napoleon and his marriage to first wife Josephine annulled because at age 46 she could not give him an heir. He married Maria Ludovicova Lipolina Francisca, Therese Josephia Lucia. What a name, 8 different names. In 1810, they called her Marie Louise, and she was the daughter of the Emperor of Austria, Francis I. Marie Louise was not the only one seen by Napoleon as a great hope to produce a male heir, but also as a unifier between France and Austria, or at least an attempt at one. When Marie Louise was told that she was to wed the unattractive emperor who conquered her country, she wasn't exactly over the moon. She wrote that the very sight of him would be the worst form of torture. Eventually, she warmed to him and had a son, Napoleon II, who was named the King of Rome. So you can see a picture of Napoleon and Marie Louise at their wedding day, and then some pictures of her with their son, Napoleon II, who would end up taking over the empire from his father. Number 23, hand in the waistcoat pose was an attempt to appear noble. This is probably the most famous picture of all that was painted of Napoleon during his entire reign, on the right there in his military uniform. This was around 35 years old, they believe, when it was painted. There have been many theories as to why Napoleon was often painted with his hand inside his coat. Some of the more popular theories hold that he had chronic stomach pain or would have some kind of skin ailment and wanted to cover it up. Others say he was winding his watch. Author and historian Arlene Meyer says this was a common pose for men of nobility and was used well before the birth of Napoleon. As Napoleon was all about ambition and appearance, he just made the pose a thing. Meyer points out in the article Redressing Classical Statuary, the 18th century hand and waistcoat portrait, that this pose was rendered with relentless frequency in the 18th century portrait painting and statuary. So it seems like that's probably the most likely theory, that this was actually a pose that many men did back there, especially people that were in the aristocracy. And of course, Napoleon wanted to be seen that way. Number 24, his last wishes were ignored. Napoleon wanted to be cremated and spread along the river Seine in Paris. Instead, he was buried at Le Hôtel National des Invalides. Initially, he was interred at St Helena. In his will, Napoleon also stated, "I die prematurely, assassinated by the English oligarchy and its assassin. The English nation will not slow in avenging me." So essentially, you can see he was interned there in St. Helena and then eventually brought back to Paris, where he is today. But he was not given his wish, which was to be cremated and spread along the River Seine. Interesting little fact, one of Napoleon's death masks is actually at UNC Chapel Hill in North Carolina in the United States. And you can see a picture of it right there. UNC Chapel Hill has this actual death mask from Napoleon. I got hold of it a very interesting way. They had a benefactor donate it to the university, and they've had it ever since. Number 25, he liked to eat quickly and in silence. You see a picture of a young Napoleon as an officer there on the right when he was in the middle of his rise. No meal with him ever lasted more than 20 minutes, for he would immediately rise from the table when he had finished dessert. He liked to eat little, fast, and often, and expected his favorite food to be ready at any hour of the day or night. His staff made sure his favorite repast, a roasted chicken, was always on hand to be kept careful inventory of the beloved fowl. Another favorite Bonaparte dish was potatoes fried with onions. He drank little wine and always unmixed, his favorite tipple being a glass of Chambertin. Napoleon would demolish his food in silence and express speed, sometimes eating the courses in reverse order and even eating with his fingers if he had pressing matters on his mind. It's really interesting that eating for him was kind of a chore that he needed to get out of the way. It wasn't something he really took a lot of pleasure in. He wanted to get it done. He wanted to get on to other things he wanted to work on. Some famous Napoleon quotes. First one there is, "Until you spread your wings, you'll have no idea how far you can fly." It's really good life advice there. Another one, "If you build an army of 100 lions and their leader is a dog, in any fight the lions will die like a dog. But if you build an army of 100 dogs and their leader is a lion, all dogs will fight like a lion." So you can imagine how much he believed in leadership and how really, when it came to military prowess, it's all about the leaders. It's all about the generals. Next one here, "A true man hates no one." Really interesting idea there that hate is a really bad emotion. Another one is, "Give me a Turkish army and I will conquer the world." He was so confident in his leadership abilities, he essentially thought you could give him any army in the world and he would go conquer the rest of the world. Didn't matter who they were. The other one is, "Death is nothing but to live defeated and inglorious is to die daily." So everything about being glorious and about living your life in a glorious way was all it was about. Otherwise, you were dying on a daily basis. Another one he had here, 6 hours sleep for a man, 7 for a woman, and 8 for a fool. So this is kind of like that idea that the more you sleep, the more you're wasting your life. So that's kind of interesting. 6 hours sleep for a man, 7 for a woman, and 8 for a fool. Next one is, "History is the version of past events that people have decided to agree upon." This really is true, and you've heard the saying that the victors go the spoils and the victors go history. So history gets told by the people that actually win the conflicts, not the people that lose the conflicts. Next one is, "Impossible is not French." So the idea of impossible or unable to do something is not a French concept in the Napoleonic world. Next one is, "The reason most people fail instead of succeed is they trade what they want most for what they want at the moment." And that really is an interesting and true statement, that people often take something less than what they really want because it's easy to get and it's at the moment, rather than being patient and waiting for what really is what they want in the end. Next one is, "You must not fight too often with an enemy or you will teach him all your art of war." So interesting concept there. Really be careful. You don't want to fight the same enemy too many times or else they're going to learn how to beat you. Last one here, "There are only two forces in the world, the sword and the spirit. In the long run, the sword will always be conquered by the spirit." It's a really interesting concept there that he was all about those two things. And if you had those two things going in concert, the sword and the spirit, then you'd always be successful. So hopefully you enjoyed that. You learned a lot in the 25 interesting facts about Napoleon. He really was a fascinating person and historical figure in our history and world history. The most consequential person in the 17 and 1800s, having been voted that way by many, many historians over the years. Had a tremendous impact on Europe overall and on the Western countries as a whole. Had a very similar impact to other leaders like Julius Caesar, like Alexander the Great, like William the Conqueror. You know, these great leaders that had such humongous impacts beyond just the country that they led, but way beyond that. And even changed cultures. It wasn't just that they made conquering actions or that they were tremendous or consequential leaders, but they literally changed cultures around the world. So really fascinating person, Napoleon I, Emperor of France, his incredible rise, his incredible fall at the end, at Waterloo and beyond. And then obviously his death at 51 years old, pretty young relatively. Would have been interesting to see what he could have done if he could have moderated himself a little bit, become a little bit more of a benevolent leader. And found a way to use his tremendous skills in a way that was more productive. Hopefully you learned a lot about Napoleon, that you're going to want to dig more into his life and learn more about him and his accomplishments, the things that he did well, the things that he didn't do well, where he overreached or where he did good things. There were things in French society that are lasting even today from Napoleon that were actually good. He had some really good things that he had instituted in the government. So he had a mixed record, but really fascinating. And we hope that you want to look into him a little bit more, and that you want to see that great movie that we showed a clip of and read some of the excellent books that have been done on Napoleon's life. We hope you love history as much as we do. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We have a lot of great episodes coming your way, and we hope you have an excellent evening. Thank you so much.